Begin. The sun beat down on the dusty town of Redemption, baking the earth a dry, cracked brown. In the heart of it all, a cloud of smoke and the clang of metal marked Silas's forge. He was a big man, strong from years of hammering hot iron, his face often smudged with soot. Sparks flew like tiny stars from his anvil as he shaped horseshoes and wagon wheels. But his hands, though rough, could also be gentle. They were gentle when he held Alara's hand, the kindest woman in Redemption. Her laughter was like a clear bell, and her eyes held a warmth that chased away the frontier's harsh chill. Silas loved his work, the honest sweat and the smell of hot steel. But more than anything, he loved Alara. She often brought him cool water while he worked, her smile brighter than any flame in his forge. Their life was simple, yet full of a quiet happiness. They dreamed of a small cabin just outside town, where the creek ran clear. But then Sheriff Brody came to Redemption. He was a cruel man, with a sneer that twisted his face and a badge he wore like a crown. He twisted the law to suit himself, and soon his corrupt ways touched Silas's world. One bleak morning, Alara was taken. Silas watched, his heart turning to a lump of cold iron, as Sheriff Brody dragged Alara to the jail, accusing her of a crime she didn't commit. The sheriff's words were lies, plain and simple, but in Redemption, Brody's word was the only law. End. Begin. The clang of Silas's hammer against the anvil had always been a steady rhythm, a comforting sound in Redemption. But after Alara was taken, it became a harsh, angry beat. He couldn't shake the image of her face, pale and scared, as Brody's rough hands pushed her towards the jail. The sheriff had accused her of stealing from the general store, a blatant lie. Everyone in town knew Alara was honest, and everyone also knew Brody was lining his pockets, squeezing folks dry. But no one dared to speak up. Brody had a way of making people disappear, or worse, making their lives a living misery. Silas had tried reasoning with him, standing tall in front of the jail, his voice low but firm. Alara didn't do anything, Sheriff. You know that. Brody had just chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. Justice is served, blacksmith. Unless you got something to say about it, you best get back to your hot metal. The glint in Brody's eyes was pure malice, a warning. Silas felt a rage bubble inside him, hotter than any forge fire, but he swallowed it down. He knew a fight right then would only hurt Alara more. He walked away, but his mind raced. The town lived in fear, and Brody was the king of that fear. Silas knew he couldn't let Alara stay in that cold jail under Brody's cruel thumb. He had to do something, even if it meant breaking every rule in the book. His hands, usually busy shaping iron, now felt empty, itching for a plan, a way to fight back. End. Begin. The air in Silas's forge felt heavy, not just with smoke, but with his thoughts. He paced, his boots crunching on iron filings, his mind a whirlwind of anger and despair. How to get Alara out? The jail was solid, built of thick timber and iron bars. Sheriff Brody kept a close watch, and his deputies were loyal, or at least too scared to defy him. A direct attack was foolish. Silas was strong, but not strong enough to fight a whole town's worth of armed men. Then, his gaze fell upon a stack of horseshoes. Curved, tough, and made of good, honest iron. An idea, wild and desperate, sparked in his mind. He remembered old tales, whispers of locksmiths and their secret tools. A key, not a real key, not one made for that jail, but a crude one shaped by his own hands. He could make something that might trick the lock, pick its inner workings. It was a long shot, a crazy gamble, but it was the only way he could think of. His unique skill, the very thing that made him a blacksmith, might be Alara's only hope. He picked up a worn horseshoe, turning it over in his calloused hands. It wasn't perfect, but with enough heat, enough hammering, and careful filing, he could change its shape. He could turn this simple piece of metal, meant for a horse's hoof, into an instrument of freedom. The thought filled him with a fierce resolve. He wouldn't just sit and wait. He would use his craft, his strength, and his love to break Alara free. The plan was risky, dangerous, and likely illegal, but Silas didn't care. He would do whatever it took. And begin. The forge roared to life, its hungry flames licking at the night. Silas plunged a horseshoe into the glowing coals, the metal hissing and spitting as it turned cherry red. Sweat beaded on his brow, catching the orange light. This wasn't just work, it was a desperate prayer hammered into iron. Each swing of his heavy hammer against the glowing metal on the anvil was a blow against Brody's injustice, a rhythm of fierce determination. Asterisk clang, clang, clang. Asterisk the sound echoed in the quiet night, a lonely, defiant song. He worked with a focus he'd never known, his eyes fixed on the metal, watching it yield, then stiffen. He used his tongs to twist and bend, then plunged it back into the fire. Sparks flew like golden rain, dusting his leather apron and singeing his hair. Iron filings, fine as dust, coated the floor, shimmering in the firelight. He wasn't just shaping metal, he was shaping hope. He knew the jail's lock was old, simple, but stubborn. He needed the key to be just right, a perfect fit for its tricky insides. He hammered one end flat, then carefully filed it, grinding away bits of metal, testing its edges against the spare lock he kept in the shop. The air filled with the sharp smell of hot iron and the metallic tang of filings. His hands, usually so sure, trembled slightly with the weight of his task. This crude key was more than just metal. It was Alara's freedom, forged in fire and desperation. And begin. The moon hung low and thin in the night sky, casting long, spooky shadows over redemption. Silas gripped the crude, heavy key he had just finished, its edges still warm from the filing. His heart thumped against his ribs like a trapped bird, each beat loud in the stillness. He moved silently through the deserted streets, sticking to the deeper shadows between buildings. Every creak of a floorboard, every rustle of dry leaves, sounded like a gunshot in the quiet. He could almost feel Sheriff Brody's eyes on him, even though the jail was still a few blocks away. The courthouse square, usually bustling, was eerily empty now. The jail stood next to the courthouse, a dark, squat building, its few windows like blank eyes. Silas pulled his hat lower, trying to make himself smaller, less noticeable. He pictured Alara inside, cold and afraid, and a fresh wave of determination washed over him, chasing away the fear. He had to reach her. He could see the dim glow of a lantern from the jailhouse office, meaning a deputy was likely awake keeping watch. That was Brody's way, always making sure his iron grip stayed tight. Silas slowed his pace, moving from shadow to shadow, his boots barely whispering on the dusty ground. The air grew colder as he got closer, a chill that had nothing to do with the night. This was the edge, the moment of truth. He was no thief, no outlaw, but tonight he would become one for Alara. And begin. Silas reached the jailhouse door, his breath catching in his throat. The old wood creaked ominously as he leaned against it, listening. Inside, a low murmur of voices, then silence. He pulled out the horseshoe key, its rough form heavy in his hand. He slid into the lock, a cold shiver running down his spine. It scraped against the tumblers, a metallic whisper in the oppressive stillness of the night. He twisted it gently, feeling for the mechanisms inside. Nothing. He tried again, pushing harder, wiggling it. Still nothing. Panic began to claw at him. Had all his work, all his hope been for nothing? Suddenly, a loud snore rattled from inside the jail. The deputy. Silas froze, pressing himself flat against the door, waiting. The snoring continued, loud and steady. He let out a slow breath. Good. The man was asleep. He tried the key one more time, pushing it deeper, twisting with a new kind of fierce patience. There was a tiny click, almost too soft to hear. Then another. He held his breath, turning the key slowly. With a loud, protesting groan, the lock gave way. Just as the latch released, a floorboard inside creaked loudly. Footsteps. Silas's blood ran cold. The deputy was awake. He shoved the door open, a sliver of light from the office spilling into the dark hallway. There, through the bars of his cell, he saw her. Alara. He had to be quick. He stepped inside, keeping low, ready for anything. The air inside smelled of dust, stale sweat, and despair. And begin. Silas moved swiftly, his eyes fixed on Alara. She was huddled in the corner of her cell, her face pale, but her eyes widened as she saw him. "Silas," she whispered, her voice a fragile gasp of disbelief and hope. He reached the bars, his fingers brushing hers. The cold iron of the cell door felt like a cruel barrier. He fumbled with the horseshoe key, his hands clumsy with urgency and relief. "I'm here, Alara. I'm getting you out," he promised, his voice rough with emotion. He slid the key into the cell lock, a smaller, simpler one than the main door. It turned with a satisfying click, and he pulled the heavy iron door open. Alara stumbled out, throwing her arms around him, burying her face in his shoulder. For a moment, time stopped. The smell of her hair, the feel of her against him, was a warmth he thought he might never know again. It was a brief, precious island of peace in the storm of their escape. But the sound of shuffling footsteps and a muffled groan from the deputy's office shattered the moment. Their hope was fragile, a tiny flame in a strong wind. "We have to go, Alara," Silas urged, gently pulling her away. He glanced towards the office, seeing the deputy stirring on his cot. They had mere seconds. Alara nodded, her eyes wide but resolute. The peril was very real, pressing in on them, but for that one shared breath, they were together, and that was all that mattered. Silas grabbed her hand, their fingers lacing together, a silent promise of courage and shared risk. "And begin." Silas pulled Alara silently from the cell, pushing the door gently shut behind them. The deputy snorted again, but didn't wake. They tiptoed past the office, their footsteps muffled on the dusty floor. Reaching the main door, Silas eased it open, just enough for them to slip through. The cool night air hit them, a welcome relief from the stale jail smell. They were out, but not yet safe. They moved quickly, keeping to the deepest shadows, weaving through the alleyways and behind buildings. Alara, though weak from her time in the jail, moved with a surprising swiftness, driven by fear and the desperate need for freedom. Every distant dog bark, every rustle of leaves made them flinch. Silas kept his ears open, listening for the telltale sounds of a patrol. The town was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that felt ready to explode. As they neared the edge of town, a faint light appeared down the main street. A lantern, and the sound of horses. Brody's patrol. Silas pulled Alara behind a stack of empty barrels, their breaths ragged. The horses clopped by, their riders chatting idly, their voices carrying on the night air. One of them hummed a tune. Silas held Alara close, their bodies pressed together, both trembling. When the sounds faded, he peered out. The street was empty again. They had dodged a bullet. Now, to make it to the open country, to disappear into the vast, unforgiving, but free wilderness. And begin. Silas and Alara didn't stop until they reached a small, abandoned miner's shack hidden deep in the hills just outside Redemption. The air here was cleaner, cooler, and for the first time since Alara was taken, they could breathe. Inside, the shack was dusty but offered a temporary haven. Silas lit a small fire in the cold hearth, the flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Alara sank onto a rickety bench, exhaustion finally catching up to her. "Are you all right, Alara?" Silas asked, his voice rough with worry. He knelt beside her, checking her for any harm. She shook her head, a tired smile gracing her lips. "I'm now, Silas. Thanks to you." Her eyes, though still a little scared, held a deep gratitude. "But what now? Brody will be furious. He won't stop looking for us." Silas stared into the small fire, the flames reflecting in his troubled eyes. He knew she was right. He had broken the law, not just by freeing Alara, but by defying Brody. He was an outlaw now, a fugitive. The quiet life they had dreamed of, the small cabin by the creek, seemed a million miles away, perhaps forever out of reach. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice grim. "We need to go far, where Brody's reach doesn't stretch." But where was that? The frontier was vast, but news traveled fast, especially when a sheriff was on the hunt. The weight of their choices pressed down on them. They had bought Alara's freedom, but what cost? Their future was uncertain, painted with the grim colors of sacrifice and endless running. And begin. The next morning, Redemption awoke to a town buzzing with a mix of fear and excitement. The news of Alara's escape from jail spread like wildfire. Sheriff Brody, his face red with fury, stormed through the courthouse square, shouting orders and kicking at dust. He had woken to an empty cell and a very confused, very sheepish deputy. The jailbreak was a direct challenge to his iron rule, and he wouldn't stand for it. He immediately sent out riders, spreading word to every corner of the territory, offering a reward for Silas and Alara, dead or alive. Among the townspeople, whispers turned into hushed conversations. Some were scared, fearing Brody's wrath would now fall on them. Silas has gone and done it now. Old man Hemlock grumbled, pulling his hat low. Brody will hang him high. Others, however, felt a flicker of something else, a quiet sense of admiration. Alara was well-liked, and everyone knew Brody was a snake. Silas's act, though lawless, was seen by some as a brave stand against a cruel tyrant. In the general store, Mrs. Gable, who had always been kind to Alara, wiped down her counter with a thoughtful look. "He did it for love," she murmured to her husband, who just grunted but didn't argue. The blacksmith's forge, usually alive with the clang of metal, stood silent and cold, a stark reminder of the missing blacksmith. Brody's intensified hunt cast a long shadow over Redemption, forcing everyone to pick a side, even if only in their hearts. The town was no longer just dusty streets and familiar faces. It was a powder keg, waiting for a spark. And begin. The air in Redemption crackled with unspoken tension. On one hand, there was the law, represented by Sheriff Brody, whose threats loomed large and real. People were taught to respect the badge, to follow the rules, even when those rules felt unfair. The idea of breaking someone out of jail, no matter the reason, was a serious crime, something that could get you strung up. Fear of Brody's harsh hand kept many silent, their eyes lowered when he rode by. Yet, a different kind of feeling stirred beneath the surface. Everyone knew Alara was good, and everyone had suffered under Brody's greedy thumb. They had seen how he twisted the law for his own gain, how he used his power to scare and hurt people. Silas's act, though illegal, felt like a powerful blow against that very injustice. It wasn't just about Alara. It was about the town's quiet longing for fairness. Old man Hemlock, despite his grumbling, left a sack of dried jerky in a canteen by Silas's cold forge one night, hoping it might help. Mrs. Gable, instead of reporting strange noises, simply turned a deaf ear. They wouldn't openly defy Brody, but they wouldn't help him either. They were caught in the middle, torn between what was right and what was lawful. The town's quiet support, born of shared suffering and a secret hope, began to chip away at Brody's power, not with bullets, but with whispers and small, secret acts of kindness. This wasn't just a jailbreak. It was a test of Redemption's soul. And begin. Days later, a riderless horse, Silas's own mount, galloped into Redemption, its saddle empty. It was a clear message. The fugitives were still out there. Brody, his patience worn thin, decided to make an example. He gathered his deputies and a few paid thugs, riding out to sweep the surrounding hills. He wouldn't rest until Silas and Alara were back in his jail, or worse. Silas and Alara, holed up in their shack, heard the distant shouts, the barking dogs. They knew their time was running out. "They're coming," Alara whispered, her hand clutching Silas's arm. "We can't outrun them forever." Silas looked at the rough walls of the shack, then at Alara's tired but determined face. Running was no life for her, for them. He thought of the townspeople, their quiet support, the small acts of defiance. He thought of Brody and the fear he held over Redemption. A plan, bold and dangerous, began to form in his mind. "No," Silas said, his voice firm. "We're not running anymore." Alara looked at him, her eyes questioning. "We're going back." He explained his idea, a desperate gamble that relied on the town's silent resentment of Brody. It meant facing the sheriff head-on in the courthouse square where everyone could see. It was a risky choice, one that could end with both of them dead. But it was also a chance, a slim one, to truly break free, not just from jail, but from Brody's iron grip on their lives and the town itself. The choice was theirs: endless flight or a final stand. And begin. The next morning, the town square slowly filled. Sheriff Brody, alerted by a nervous deputy, stood before the jail, his hand on his gun, a sneer on his face. He expected a fight. Instead, Silas and Alara walked into the square, hand in hand, heads held high. Silas carried no weapon, only the crude horseshoe key, a symbol of his defiance. A hush fell over the crowd. "Brody!" Silas's voice boomed, clear and strong, cutting through the silence. "You jailed an innocent woman. You've terrorized this town long enough." Brody scoffed, drawing his pistol. "You're a fool, blacksmith, and an outlaw. This ends here." His deputies raised their guns, but their eyes darted to the faces in the crowd. The townspeople, usually cowering, stood straighter, their gazes fixed on Silas. There was no fear in their eyes, only a quiet expectation. Mrs. Gable stood near the front, her lips set in a firm line. Old Man Hemlock held a rusty shotgun, pointed at the ground, but its presence was clear. A tense standoff. Brody barked at the townspeople. "Are you with me? Or with this lawbreaker?" The silence was deafening. No one stepped forward to support him. Instead, a few brave souls shifted their weight, their eyes locking with Silas's. It was a silent vote, a clear message. The blacksmith, not the sheriff, held their trust. Brody's face twisted in disbelief, then rage. The town, influenced by Silas's bold actions, had chosen. They had embraced a new, more just path, away from Brody's corrupt rule. And begin. In the end, Brody, seeing the unified front of the town, backed down, his face a mask of bitter defeat. He knew he was beaten, not by a gunfight, but by the will of the people he had tried to control. He rode out of redemption that day, never to return. The town chose a new sheriff, a fair man, and slowly, redemption began to heal. Silas and Alara stayed. They rebuilt their lives side by side. Silas's forge once again rang with the honest clang of metal, but now it sounded different. It was a sound of freedom, a reminder of the day one man, driven by love, dared to stand against injustice. Their act was illegal, a clear break from the law, but it had brought about a true form of justice that the law had failed to provide. The story of Silas and Alara became a legend in redemption, told around campfires and in hushed tones. It taught that sometimes courage meant breaking the rules when the rules were wrong. It showed that even in a harsh frontier town, a single act of defiance, fueled by fierce love, could ignite a change that swept through an entire community. The lines between right and wrong had blurred, but from that blur emerged a clearer path for redemption, a town that learned to value integrity over fear. Silas, the blacksmith, wasn't just a hero. He was a living testament to the power of a heart that refused to be broken. And